Living Under Constant Guilt. Chapter 1. The weight you carry without noticing. There is a specific kind of tiredness that sleep does not fix. You wake up, you rest, you even have moments of calm, and yet everything still feels heavy. Not dramatic, not tragic, just heavy. You feel low on energy. Starting things feels harder than it should. Money feels tense, either hard to earn, hard to keep, or hard to enjoy. Even simple actions come with resistance, and often you cannot explain why. You may tell yourself that you are lazy, or unmotivated, or burned out, or simply not disciplined enough. But underneath all of this, there is often something quieter and more powerful at work. Guilt. Not the obvious kind. Not the kind that screams, "You did something wrong," but a low-level, constant guilt that lives in the background of your mind and body. The kind of guilt that makes rest feel undeserved. The kind that makes enjoyment feel suspicious. The kind that whispers that you should be doing more, giving more, trying harder, even when no one is asking. This guilt does not feel dramatic. It feels normal, and that is why it is so exhausting. When you live under constant guilt, your nervous system never fully relaxes. Even in moments of stillness, there is an invisible tension, a sense that something is pending, unfinished, or owed. You may feel guilty for not working enough, then guilty for working too much, guilty for wanting more, guilty for not being satisfied, guilty for resting, guilty for needing help, guilty for thinking about yourself. Over time, this creates a specific internal state. You are always slightly bracing, and when you are always bracing, energy drains faster than it can be restored. This is why guilt is not just an emotion. It is a condition your body learns to live in. Guilt keeps you in a permanent should mode. Should be better, should be faster, should be more grateful, should be more productive, should not want so much. Under guilt, action does not feel like choice. It feels like obligation. And when action feels like obligation, your system resists. Not because you're broken, but because pressure is not sustainable fuel. This is where many people get confused. They believe their lack of energy means they are unmotivated. They believe their difficulty with money means they lack ambition. They believe their resistance to action means something is wrong with them. But often, the issue is not lack of drive. It is the constant emotional taxation of guilt. Guilt turns every action into a moral test. Every decision becomes evidence for or against your worth. Every pause feels like failure. In this state, even success does not bring relief. It only raises the bar. Because guilt does not ask, "Are you okay?" It asks, "Why aren't you doing more?" And when guilt is present, the body stays tense. The mind stays alert. The system stays guarded. This is why guilt quietly blocks money. Not because you do not deserve it, but because receiving without repayment feels unsafe. Because ease feels wrong. Because abundance triggers the fear of being exposed as undeserving. This is why guilt blocks action. Not because you do not care, but because every step forward feels loaded with pressure, expectation, and self-judgment. And this is why guilt drains energy more effectively than stress. Stress at least has an endpoint. Guilt does not. It follows you into rest, into thinking, into planning, into silence. Most people do not realize they are living under guilt because it has been normalized. It often starts early, through responsibility, expectations, emotional roles, or the need to be good. Over time, guilt becomes the background noise of life. You stop questioning it. You start building your entire rhythm around it. You work not from desire, but from relief-seeking. You act not because you want to, but because you want the pressure to ease, even briefly. But guilt never truly eases. It only shifts. This audiobook is not about eliminating guilt overnight. It is about recognizing how deeply it shapes your energy, your actions, and your relationship with money and effort. Before anything can change, one thing must happen first. You must see the weight you have been carrying, not because you are weak, but because you learned to live under it. And once you see it clearly, something important begins to loosen. Not through force, not through self-forgiveness rituals, not through telling yourself to let it go, but through understanding how guilt gained authority over your life and why your system has been tired for so long. This is where the real work begins. Chapter 2. How Guilt Becomes a Way of Living. Guilt rarely enters your life as a sudden event. It does not arrive loudly or dramatically. Most of the time, it grows slowly, quietly, and almost invisibly. At first, guilt appears as a signal, a reminder, a way to stay connected to others, to responsibilities, to values. In small doses, guilt can be useful. It helps regulate behavior. It keeps social bonds intact. It signals when something needs repair. But guilt becomes destructive when it stops being situational and turns into a constant internal posture. This usually happens without you noticing. Over time, guilt shifts from, I did something wrong, to I'm doing something wrong, and eventually to, I am wrong by default. When this happens, guilt is no longer about actions. It becomes part of identity. You start living as if you owe something, constantly. Owe effort, owe productivity, owe emotional availability, owe self-sacrifice, owe justification for your existence. This is how guilt becomes a way of living rather than a response to a specific situation. Many people learn this pattern early. They learn that love comes with conditions, that rest must be earned, that saying no creates discomfort, that wanting more is selfish, that ease means someone else is losing. Guilt becomes the price of belonging. And once guilt is tied to belonging, it becomes very hard to question. Because questioning guilt can feel like risking connection, approval, or safety. As a result, the nervous system adapts. It learns to stay slightly tense, slightly alert, slightly braced, even when nothing is happening. This constant low-level tension consumes energy, not in bursts, but continuously. That is why people living under guilt often feel tired without knowing why. Their system is never fully off duty. Guilt also changes how you make decisions. Instead of asking, what do I want? You ask, what should I do? Instead of, what feels right? You ask, what would be acceptable? Over time, your internal compass weakens. You stop trusting your own signals. You rely more on pressure than on clarity. This is where guilt quietly hijacks productivity. Actions driven by guilt do not come from engagement. They come from avoidance, avoiding the discomfort of feeling like you are not enough. You work to escape guilt, not to create. You push to silence the inner pressure, not because the task itself matters. This creates a paradox. The more you act from guilt, the more guilt grows. Because relief-based action never resolves the underlying sense of owing. There is always another task, another expectation, another reason you could be doing more. This is why guilt-driven people often struggle with money in complex ways. Earning can feel heavy. Spending can feel wrong. Receiving can feel undeserved. Money becomes emotionally charged, not because of lack, but because guilt attaches morality to it. You may feel guilty for wanting more, guilty for charging fairly, guilty for resting after earning, guilty for enjoying what you have. So money never feels neutral. It feels like something that must be justified. The same pattern appears with rest. Rest under guilt is never complete. It is interrupted by thoughts of what you should be doing. It is filled with mental checklists and quiet self-reproach. This means rest does not restore energy. It only pauses activity. True restoration requires safety, and guilt removes the sense of safety. Living under constant guilt trains you to live in a state of permanent accountability, not to reality, but to an internalized judge. That judge is rarely explicit. It is more of a presence, a background pressure, a feeling that you are always slightly behind. And because this state becomes familiar, it starts to feel normal. You may not even label it as guilt. You may call it responsibility, or discipline, or maturity. But responsibility without flexibility becomes rigidity. Discipline without compassion becomes exhaustion. Maturity without permission becomes emotional starvation. This audiobook is not about removing responsibility from your life. It is about distinguishing responsibility from guilt, because responsibility supports action. Guilt drains it. Understanding how guilt became embedded in your system is not about blame. It is about accuracy. Once you can see that guilt is not a personal flaw, but a learned internal environment, you stop fighting yourself. And when the fight stops, energy begins to return, not suddenly, but steadily. Before change can happen, one thing must become clear. You are not tired because you lack strength. You are tired because you have been carrying weight that was never meant to be permanent. And the moment you recognize that weight for what it is, the system begins to respond. That is where the next shift begins. C. Chapter 3. Why guilt blocks energy, money, and action. Guilt does not stop you by force. It stops you by draining the system that makes movement possible. Energy is not just physical strength. It is psychological permission. It is the sense that you are allowed to act, to receive, to rest, and to expand without immediate consequence. Guilt quietly removes that permission. When guilt is present, your body stays on alert. Not in a dramatic way. In a low, continuous way that signals, stay careful, stay small, stay accountable. This state consumes energy before you ever take action. That is why even simple tasks can feel heavy. Not because they are difficult, but because they require pushing through internal resistance created by guilt. Guilt creates resistance by turning action into risk. Every step forward carries an unspoken question. Am I allowed to do this? Have I earned this? Is this too much? Will this cost someone else? These questions rarely appear as clear thoughts. They show up as hesitation, as delay, as fatigue, as loss of momentum. This is how guilt blocks action, not by saying no, but by making every yes feel loaded. The same mechanism applies to money. Money represents choice, expansion, and independence. And guilt is deeply uncomfortable with all three. When guilt is active, earning more can feel threatening. Not because you do not want money, but because money disrupts familiar dynamics of obligation and self-sacrifice. Receiving more means owing less. And guilt depends on owing. This is why people living under guilt often unconsciously limit themselves. They undercharge. They overgive. They hesitate to ask. They sabotage opportunities that feel too easy or too aligned. It is not because they do not value themselves. It is because ease feels unsafe when guilt has been the organizing force. Guilt also distorts effort. Instead of effort being a tool, it becomes a form of payment. You work not to move forward, but to prove that you are trying hard enough. This leads to a specific kind of exhaustion. You may be active, but not effective. Busy, but not progressing. Constantly doing, but rarely moving. Because guilt-driven effort is not strategic, it is compensatory. You do more to offset an internal sense of being behind. Over time, this breaks the relationship between effort and outcome. You stop trusting that doing the right thing will lead to results. You start believing that only suffering counts. This belief is deeply damaging. It trains the nervous system to associate growth with pain, and the body resists pain by slowing down. This is why guilt can coexist with ambition. You may want more, you may dream, you may plan. But when it comes time to act, something tightens. This tightening is not fear of failure. It is fear of relief. Because relief under guilt feels suspicious. It feels like cheating, like skipping a necessary punishment. So the system unconsciously chooses delay. Delay preserves guilt, and guilt preserves familiarity. This is also why guilt makes rest ineffective. You may stop working, but you do not stop monitoring yourself. You rest with conditions, with timelines, with mental negotiations. As a result, rest does not replenish energy. It simply pauses activity while pressure remains. True energy returns only when the system feels safe enough to release vigilance, and guilt prevents that release. Most people respond to this dynamic by trying to override it. They push harder. They discipline themselves. They add structure and pressure. But pressure does not dissolve guilt. It feeds it. Because guilt interprets pressure as confirmation that it is necessary. This creates a closed loop. Guilt drains energy. Low energy reduces action. Reduced action increases guilt. And the cycle reinforces itself. Breaking this cycle does not require eliminating guilt. It requires removing its authority over movement. That shift begins not with effort, but with awareness. When you start to see how guilt operates in your body, your decisions, and your relationship with money and action, something important changes. You stop personalizing the resistance. You realize that what feels like lack of willpower is often a protective response to chronic internal pressure. And once resistance is understood as information rather than failure, it no longer needs to control behavior. This understanding does not instantly create energy, but it stops the leak. And when the leak stops, energy slowly begins to return, not as a surge, but as steadiness. That steadiness is what allows action to become possible again, without force, without self-attack, and without needing guilt as fuel. This is the foundation for the next shift. Chapter 4. How Guilt Turns Life into Permanent Owing. Guilt does not simply make you feel bad, it restructures how you experience life. Under guilt, life is no longer something you participate in. It becomes something you must constantly repay. You wake up already behind. Behind on effort. Behind on responsibility. Behind on who you think you should be. This creates a subtle but persistent sense of debt, not financial debt. Existential debt. You feel as though your presence, your needs, your desires, all require justification. As if simply existing is not enough. You must continuously earn your place. This is how guilt turns life into permanent owing. You owe productivity. You owe usefulness. You owe emotional availability. You owe resilience. You owe gratitude. And because the debt is never clearly defined, it can never be fully paid. This is one of the most exhausting aspects of guilt. There is no finish line, no moment where you can say, "Now I've done enough." No point where the system relaxes and allows you to rest without conditions. Even achievements are absorbed into the debt. You succeed and immediately feel pressure to maintain it. You earn and feel tension about deserving it. You grow and feel responsible for not falling back. Guilt reframes progress as obligation. Instead of feeling supported by your achievements, you feel bound by them. This is why guilt-driven lives often look functional on the outside, but feel suffocating on the inside. You may appear responsible, reliable, capable. Others may admire your discipline or strength. But internally, everything feels tight. Because guilt does not allow enjoyment to stand on its own. It demands repayment. Enjoyment must be earned. Rest must be justified. Ease must be temporary. And when ease appears without clear cause, guilt intervenes. It whispers that something is wrong. You are being careless. That you are forgetting something important. So even moments of calm are interrupted. This constant sense of owing also shapes how you relate to other people. You may overgive, over-explain, overperform emotionally. Not because you are generous by nature, but because guilt equates worth with contribution. You feel safest when you are needed, when you are useful, when you are carrying weight. Letting go of responsibility feels dangerous, not because the responsibility is real, but because guilt uses it to justify your presence. This dynamic is especially visible around money. Money, under guilt, becomes a moral issue rather than a neutral tool. You may feel uncomfortable charging fairly, uncomfortable receiving without over-delivering, uncomfortable enjoying what you earn. Because money feels like evidence that must be defended. The idea of enough becomes unreachable. There is always someone doing more, suffering more, trying harder, and guilt constantly compares. This comparison is not conscious. It operates as a background pressure that keeps you from settling. Even when life is objectively stable, guilt prevents internal stability. This is why people living under guilt often feel restless without knowing why. They are not restless because they want more. They are restless because stillness feels irresponsible. Stillness under guilt feels like neglect. Neglect of duty, neglect of effort, neglect of proving oneself. So movement becomes compulsory. Not movement towards something meaningful, but movement away from discomfort. This is where guilt quietly distorts identity. You stop seeing yourself as someone who chooses. You begin to see yourself as someone who owes effort, owes justification, owes explanation. This identity is incredibly heavy, and because it feels moral, it is rarely questioned. You may believe that without guilt, you would become selfish, lazy, careless. But guilt does not create responsibility. It replaces clarity with pressure. Responsibility is grounded in choice and context. Guilt is grounded in fear of not being enough. As long as guilt governs your actions, life will feel like a series of unpaid bills. Even when you are doing well, even when nothing is wrong. Understanding this shift, from living to owing, is crucial, because the moment you recognize that guilt has turned your life into a permanent repayment plan, you can begin to question its authority, not by rejecting responsibility, but by separating responsibility from self-punishment. That separation is not dramatic. It is subtle, but it changes everything. When life stops being something you owe, movement becomes lighter, choices become clearer, energy becomes available again. This is not the end of guilt, but it is the beginning of a different relationship with it. One where guilt no longer defines the terms of your existence, and that opens the door to a different way of living, one not built on debt, but on permission. Chapter 5. How Guilt Keeps Rebuilding Itself. Guilt does not survive because it is true. It survives because it is self-reinforcing. Once guilt becomes part of your internal environment, it begins to recreate the conditions that justify its existence. This happens quietly. Guilt tells you that you must do more. You respond by pushing yourself. Pushing exhausts you. Exhaustion slows you down. Slowing down triggers more guilt. And the loop closes. From the inside, this feels like a personal failure. From the outside, it is a system doing exactly what it was trained to do. Guilt also rebuilds itself through interpretation. When something goes wrong, guilt says, "This is because you didn't try hard enough." When something goes right, guilt says, "You were lucky," or "You'll have to keep this up." There is no outcome that allows guilt to dissolve. Success becomes pressure. Difficulty becomes evidence. Rest becomes suspicious. In this way, guilt makes itself indispensable. Another way guilt sustains itself is through identity. When you have lived under guilt for a long time, it begins to feel like part of who you are. You may describe yourself as responsible, conscientious, or hardworking. But underneath these traits is often a fear. If I stop feeling guilty, I will stop functioning. This fear keeps guilt in place, because guilt has been confused with discipline, with morality, with care. Letting go of guilt can feel like letting go of structure itself. So the system holds on. Guilt also rebuilds itself through comparison. You notice what others are doing, how much they are producing, how much they seem to handle. Guilt uses these observations selectively. It highlights what you are not doing. It ignores context, capacity, and reality. This comparison is not meant to inspire. It is meant to confirm inadequacy. And confirmation keeps guilt alive. One of the most powerful ways guilt maintains control is through urgency. It creates the feeling that something must be done immediately. That delay is dangerous. That pause equals failure. This sense of urgency bypasses reflection. You act not because the action is necessary, but because the pressure is intolerable. Relief becomes the reward. But relief is temporary. Once the action is complete, guilt shifts its focus. There is always another reason to feel behind. This is how guilt ensures it is never resolved. Even awareness alone can trigger guilt. You may notice guilt operating and immediately feel guilty for noticing it too late, or not doing enough about it. Guilt adapts quickly. This does not mean awareness is useless. It means awareness must be paired with a different relationship to action. As long as guilt dictates timing, effort, and worth, it will continue to regenerate. Breaking this cycle does not require suppressing guilt. It requires refusing to organize your actions around it. This is a subtle but crucial distinction. You may still feel guilt, but you stop letting it decide what happens next. When guilt arises, you do not immediately respond. You do not compensate. You do not explain yourself internally. You pause. This pause is not avoidance. It is interruption. It interrupts the automatic loop that guilt depends on. At first, this pause feels uncomfortable. The system is used to movement as a way to reduce pressure. But over time, the pause introduces something new. Choice. Choice weakens guilt because guilt requires inevitability. It needs you to believe there is only one acceptable response. When you realize there are multiple responses, guilt loses authority. This does not make you careless. It makes you deliberate. You begin to act from clarity instead of obligation, from alignment instead of repayment. And when actions are no longer used to manage guilt, their emotional cost decreases. You are no longer paying an internal debt with every task. This is how the loop begins to loosen. Not through confrontation, not through self-forgiveness exercises, but through changing what guilt is allowed to control. Guilt may continue to appear, but it no longer gets to rebuild itself through your behavior. And when guilt stops being reinforced, it slowly loses strength. This creates space, space where energy can stabilize, space where money feels less charged, space where action becomes possible without pressure. This is not the end of guilt's presence, but it is the end of guilt's dominance. And that shift prepares the ground for something important, a way of moving through life that does not require self-punishment to function. Chapter 6. Living without guilt as fuel. At some point, the question stops being how to get rid of guilt. The more important question becomes how to live without using guilt as fuel. For a long time, guilt may have been the force that kept you moving. It pushed you to act. It kept you responsible. It made sure you did not fall behind. So the idea of loosening guilt can feel unsettling. If guilt is not driving me, what will? This fear is understandable, but it rests on a misunderstanding. Guilt does not create movement. It creates pressure. And pressure is not the same as momentum. Momentum comes from clarity, capacity, and trust. Pressure comes from fear of consequence. When you stop using guilt as fuel, action does not disappear. It changes quality. Movement becomes quieter, more selective, less frantic. You stop doing things to relieve internal tension. You start doing things because they make sense in context. This shift does not happen all at once. It happens gradually, through small moments where you choose not to punish yourself into action. You may still notice guilt arising, but instead of responding automatically, you observe it. You notice how it tightens the body, how it accelerates thoughts, how it narrows your sense of options, and instead of obeying it, you ask a different question. Not, what should I be doing? But, what is actually needed right now? This question changes everything. It brings you back into reality instead of obligation. It reconnects action to circumstance rather than debt. Sometimes what is needed is action. Sometimes it is rest. Sometimes it is adjustment. Sometimes it is stopping. Under guilt, all of these feel wrong except pushing forward. Without guilt as fuel, they become available again. This is where energy begins to reorganize. Not into bursts of intensity, but into steadiness. You may notice that you do less, but move further. That you say no more easily. That you tolerate unfinishedness without panic. This does not make you irresponsible. It makes you responsive. Living without guilt as fuel also changes your relationship with money. You stop treating money as proof of worth or failure. Earning becomes functional rather than moral. Receiving becomes less charged. You may still have limits. You may still have fears. But the constant sense of owing begins to soften. Money becomes something you work with, not something you must justify. The same happens with rest. Rest becomes restorative rather than anxious. Not because guilt is gone, but because it no longer governs the terms. You rest because rest supports life, not because you have earned it or failed to avoid it. Over time, this creates a new internal environment, one where movement does not require self-attack, one where pauses do not trigger collapse, one where effort is proportional rather than compensatory. This is what people often mistake for motivation. But it is not motivation, it is permission. Permission to act without punishment, permission to pause without shame, permission to want without justification. This permission does not come from affirmations, it comes from understanding. Understanding how guilt shaped your system, understanding why your exhaustion made sense, understanding that you were not failing, you were responding to pressure. As this understanding settles, guilt loses its urgency. It may still appear, but it no longer feels like an emergency. And when guilt is no longer urgent, it is no longer powerful. You do not need to fight it. You do not need to eliminate it. You simply stop organizing your life around it. This is the quiet transformation at the heart of this audiobook. Not becoming fearless, not becoming endlessly confident, but becoming someone who can move, choose, and live without needing guilt to function. When guilt stops being the engine, life stops feeling like a constant repayment plan. And in that space, energy returns, action becomes possible, and life begins to feel lighter, not because it is easier, but because it is no longer driven by debt. The more important question becomes how to live without using guilt as fuel. For a long time, guilt may have been the force that kept you moving. It pushed you to act. It kept you responsible. It made sure you did not fall behind. So the idea of loosening guilt can feel unsettling. If guilt is not driving me, what will? This fear is understandable, but it rests on a misunderstanding. Guilt does not create movement. It creates pressure. And pressure is not the same as momentum. Momentum comes from clarity, capacity, and trust. Pressure comes from fear of consequence. When you stop using guilt as fuel, action does not disappear. It changes quality. Movement becomes quieter, more selective, less frantic. You stop doing things to relieve internal tension. You start doing things because they make sense in context. This shift does not happen all at once. It happens gradually, through small moments where you choose not to punish yourself into action. You may still notice guilt arising, but instead of responding automatically, you observe it. You notice how it tightens the body, how it accelerates thoughts, how it narrows your sense of options. And instead of obeying it, you ask a different question. Not, what should I be doing? But, what is actually needed right now? This question changes everything. It brings you back into reality instead of obligation. It reconnects action to circumstance rather than debt. Sometimes what is needed is action. Sometimes it is rest. Sometimes it is adjustment. Sometimes it is stopping. Under guilt, all of these feel wrong, except pushing forward. Without guilt as fuel, they become available again. This is where energy begins to reorganize. Not into bursts of intensity, but into steadiness. You may notice that you do less, but move further. That you say no more easily. That you tolerate unfinishedness without panic. This does not make you irresponsible. It makes you responsive. Living without guilt as fuel also changes your relationship with money. You stop treating money as proof of worth or failure. Earning becomes functional rather than moral. Receiving becomes less charged. You may still have limits. You may still have fears. But the constant sense of owing begins to soften. Money becomes something you work with, not something you must justify. The same happens with rest. Rest becomes restorative rather than anxious, not because guilt is gone, but because it no longer governs the terms. You rest because rest supports life, not because you have earned it or failed to avoid it. Over time, this creates a new internal environment, one where movement does not require self-attack, one where pauses do not trigger collapse, one where effort is proportional rather than compensatory. This is what people often mistake for motivation. But it is not motivation, it is permission. Permission to act without punishment. Permission to pause without shame. Permission to want without justification. This permission does not come from affirmations. It comes from understanding. Understanding how guilt shaped your system. Understanding why your exhaustion made sense. Understanding that you were not failing, you were responding to pressure. As this understanding settles, guilt loses its urgency. It may still appear, but it no longer feels like an emergency. And when guilt is no longer urgent, it is no longer powerful. You do not need to fight it. You do not need to eliminate it. You simply stop organizing your life around it. This is the quiet transformation at the heart of this audiobook. Not becoming fearless, not becoming endlessly confident, but becoming someone who can move, choose, and live without needing guilt to function. When guilt stops being the engine, life stops feeling like a constant repayment plan. And in that space, energy returns, action becomes possible, and life begins to feel lighter, not because it is easier, but because it is no longer driven by debt. Chapter 7. Practical Ways to Stop Living from Guilt. Guilt becomes destructive not because it exists, but because it is used as a system of control. When guilt decides when you act, how much you do, how long you push, and whether you are allowed to rest, life turns into a constant attempt to repay an invisible debt. The goal is not to eliminate guilt, but to remove its authority over action. The first shift happens at the moment guilt appears. Guilt always creates urgency. It insists that something must be done immediately, otherwise you risk becoming careless, irresponsible, or wrong. This urgency is not information. It is pressure. The most effective way to weaken guilt is to interrupt this speed. When guilt rises, pause for one slow breath. Do not analyze, justify, or correct yourself. Simply interrupt the automatic response. This pause breaks the rule that guilt must immediately be paid with action. Without speed, guilt loses part of its power. After the pause, name what is happening. Guilt almost always speaks in shoulds. You should be doing more. You should not be resting. You should already be better. These sentences feel like facts, but they are not. They are internal scripts. Labeling them as such matters, because guilt depends on being treated as truth. When it is recognized as a pattern, it becomes less convincing. The next step is separating guilt from responsibility. Responsibility is specific and situational. It involves repair when real harm has occurred. Guilt is global and vague. It targets your worth, your effort, and your right to exist comfortably. When something feels wrong, ask one clear question. Does this situation require repair, or does it only trigger self-punishment? If repair is needed, take one specific action and stop. If it is guilt, do not repair. Recentering is enough. Action under guilt is usually compensatory. It is larger, heavier, and more exhausting than necessary. The alternative is clean action. A clean action is small, specific, and proportional to the actual task, not to the emotional pressure. It does not aim to prove worth or reduce shame. It simply moves reality forward. When guilt demands excessive effort, choose the smallest action that still counts. Open the document and write a few sentences. Take the next concrete step instead of the entire plan. Clean action builds trust in a new way of moving. It shows that progress does not require self-attack. Guilt is often deeply tied to money. Earning, spending, and receiving can all trigger internal judgment. Money becomes moralized, treated as evidence that must be defended. To weaken this link, shift money back into function. Use a neutral framing. Money is a tool, not a verdict. Then ask what a calm, responsible response looks like, rather than a guilty one. This reduces extremes and restores clarity. Rest is another area where guilt maintains control. Under guilt, rest feels conditional. It must be earned through exhaustion or justified through productivity. This prevents rest from restoring energy. The system never fully relaxes. A different rule is needed. Rest is maintenance, not a reward. When guilt appears during rest, it does not require action. It requires tolerance. Staying with rest despite discomfort retrains the nervous system to experience safety without repayment. Guilt also survives through over-explaining. Internally and externally, There is pressure to justify decisions, limits, and needs. This keeps the mind in a defensive position. Reducing explanations weakens guilt's grip. Decisions do not need to be defended endlessly. One clear sentence is enough. Action does not need permission. Over time, patterns become visible. Guilt tends to repeat itself in predictable situations. Before starting, after resting, when receiving, when choosing ease. Once a week, reviewing where guilt drove behavior and what it cost creates distance. Guilt stops being a moral authority and becomes data. From that position, alternatives become easier to choose. As guilt loses its role as a driving force, movement changes quality. Actions become quieter and more deliberate. Energy stabilizes instead of spiking and crashing. Effort becomes proportional rather than compensatory. Rest becomes effective. Money becomes less charged. Life stops feeling like a constant repayment plan. Guilt may still appear. It does not disappear overnight. But it no longer organizes decisions. It no longer dictates timing or worth. When guilt is no longer the fuel, action becomes sustainable. Life becomes less heavy, not because demands disappear, but because self-punishment is no longer required to function. This shift is not dramatic. It is practical. It shows up in small moments where guilt is noticed, interrupted, and no longer obeyed. Over time, these moments accumulate, and the system that once depended on pressure begins to operate from clarity instead.